Rise of the dead. Black magic rights, jungle lords on race.
Hello, Howie Bentley here. Welcome to episode 2 of Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. Today, I'm going to be talking with Matthew Knight. Some of you know him as the vocalist for Cauldron Born, and some of you probably as well know him as the vocalist, guitarist, and he plays a number of other instruments for his own band, Eternal Winter. So with that being said, on to the conversation. So hey, Matt, how are we today?
Good. How's it going?
Doing great, man. Lots of snow up there in Maryland.
Yeah, we got some snow coming down, and just hanging out.
Yeah, we're snowed in here in Kentucky. So I want to start off with a brief history of Eternal Winter. What can you tell us about, the formation of the band and so on, all the details?
Oh yeah, sure. I started the band in 2002 with a vision to create, my ultimate vision of a fantasy storytelling heavy metal band. We started out, just recording demos and doing a whole lot of live shows. And I got into writing stories at that time to have songs to write about. They were, pretty juvenile, but had some pretty cool creative ideas, and ended up coming up with this fantasy saga that the early songs were based on. And from there, just that kind of branched into the writing thing and all that. So it's like I said, started the band in 2002, and been going strong ever since, and still into 2024.
Awesome. So you have 2 full-length albums out, correct?
Right, yeah. Within the Castle Shadowgate, and then also our latest one is called Archaic Lore Enshrined.
Okay. So what can you tell us about the lyrical themes on Within the Castle Shadowgate?
Sure. So the Shadowgate album those songs were based on a Eternal Winter concept story that I wrote with Gordon, the bass player, long time ago. And I sort of arranged the songs in a way that it doesn't flow like a rock opera sort of concept album would. It's more like various songs are about different sections of the story. I think there was someone asked Robert E. Howard one time about his Conan stories and why they didn't go in sequential order. One moment he's like a thief, and the next minute he's like King of Aquilonia or whatever. And his response was that he wanted it to seem like you were sitting around a campfire with Conan, and he was relating the stories, as they came to him. And that's sort of the idea I had with that. It's like different moments from the story that don't necessarily go in any order, but fit together really nicely on an album. The second album, Archaic Lore Enshrined, that's sort of my tribute to all my favorite sword and sorcery, pulp, gothic fiction authors, and those songs are all based on that stuff.
And the cover to Archaic Lore Enshrined that's C.L. Moore's character, Jarell of Jewelry, depicted on that cover, correct?
That's right. It's a scene from it was painted by Louis Brackett, really talented artist. And it's a scene from the opening scene from her story Hellsguard, which is one of my favorite stories. And there's a track on the album based on it, a really long song. I think it's like 11 minutes. That's the cover of the album. It's got Jarell of Jewelry approaching the castle of Hellsguard at sunset.
Yeah, it's a great cover. So speaking of some of these authors who have influenced you, so how did you get into sword and sorcery? What hooked you, and who are some of your top authors in the genre?
Yeah, sure. Well, I started out pretty young, reading fantasy stuff. You know, back in the 80s when I was growing up, Tolkien and Dragonlance and things like that. Edgar Allan Poe, which I wanted to do a toast because today is Edgar Allan Poe's birthday. So cheers and happy birthday.
Thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah, but yeah, Edgar Allan Poe was a big influence on me when I was really young. We were introduced to Poe in grade school, living here in Maryland, and he's like this Baltimore icon. We really had a lot of exposure to his works, which also really opened me up to fantastical kind of literature. But it wasn't until I entered a used bookstore, I guess like in my early 20s, and I've been reading all this fantasy stuff. I went in this bookstore and I saw on the shelf covers of Michael Moorcock's Elric books, and also I think it was Robert E. Howard's Bram McMorran collection, and I was like blown away by the covers, so I immediately bought them. And then I quickly realized that this is a much different genre of fantasy than what I was used to. Sword and sorcery is fast-paced, a lot of action and bloodshed and dark magic, all this stuff that was not in the elves and dragons sort of fantasy that I was used to. And so I not only that, I also picked up on the format of the stories, the short story format, the pulp style format that the way the stories are written. And I thought, this is kind of the way I write stories for the band, the short, kind of condensed, fast-paced tales. So that really appealed to me. I'd slogged through all the 400-page novels and things like that, and while I enjoyed it, it really appealed to me that these were so condensed. So it also was an inspiration to start writing. The first authors I got into, of course, like I said, Michael Moorcock was a big one of my favorites. And then Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber. Then I got into Poul Anderson and C.L. Moore, Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft, all that stuff. It just was like, an explosion once I discovered it.
All the classics.
Yeah, sure.
That being said, could you give me a top 5 sword and sorcery novels? Now, sword and sorcery novels are a little harder to do because there aren't that many, in my opinion, there aren't that many great sword and sorcery novels. It works, like you mentioned before, as a short story, more condensed type thing. But am I putting you on the spot here? Could you name a top 5 sword and sorcery novels?
Top 5. It's tough, like you say, novels, because I think a lot of these, as the longer ones, is more of like novellas. Ones that come to mind, sword and sorcery novels, of course, The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson was one of my favorites and still is. Also, of course, Hour of the Dragon by Howard is like, one of the ultimate sword and sorcery novels, I'd say.
And that was the first. That was the first sword and sorcery novel.
Also, again, like thinking of novellas, Michael Moorcock's Quorum series. Those were, I guess, they're novellas. You wouldn't really call them novel, but they feel like novels to me because it wasn't very split up. It was like the books were felt like complete adventures. So I definitely would say those of all Moorcock stuff I was real big into. I'm trying to think of other novels. I did read one of David Smith's The Sorcerer's Shadow, like that. Yeah.
That's a really underrated gem there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I can go on about the short stories, but as far as the novels go, that might be the extent of full-length sword and sorcery novels that I can really think of.
I got you. So you have been writing sword and sorcery tales and being published since you've been published since I think 2015, and Barbarian Crowns was the first book, or was there something before that?
Oh yeah, that was the first one that I appeared in, and I actually have 3 stories in there. One of them was supposed to be in that publisher's other anthology, The Devil's Armory, but it got put in that one. So yeah, that was the first time.
Right. So then around that same time, Juan Gutierrez had contacted me and about being in Barbarian Crowns, because he was supposed to be the editor, and for whatever reason, he just fell off the grid there, and somebody else took over and finished the book as far as the editor, putting the book together. But there was, I mentioned to you about him talking to you at the time. He said, "Oh, I've already talked to him. Already got a story or whatever from him, or a number of stories." And he had talked with Byron Roberts as well, and a couple of the guys from some of the Greek bands. There was not Dexter Ward, but Battle Roar. And the other band, well, they're actually from Cyprus, is Solitary Sabered. And then you put together a CD, a split CD with all those bands on it called Blood Mist at Dawn, correct? So what can you tell me about that?
Oh, yeah, I have a copy of it here, actually. You can see really great artwork by Joseph Vargo, not the light. But
yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's excellent. It was, like I said, it was an exciting time because I was finally getting to where I was releasing fiction outside of the band. So I noticed that there was like other heavy metal artists that had written stories in the book. So I thought, hey, we should all get together and do a compilation album, just with some of our best songs. And that's what we did. So yeah, it's a cool compilation. Features all those great bands you mentioned. Great epic metal collection, and one of the best ones, I would say.
And out of that, of course, there was you and me and Byron Roberts, and you decided you wanted to do a round robin, which brings us to this right here, Carav Phantomclad, Rider of the Cosmic Ice. So what can you tell our viewers about the inspiration behind Carav Phantomclad, Rider of the Cosmic Ice?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, was really inspired to write new stories. And I had been reading this book called Gore Kinslayer. I have a copy of it here. Now, the original copy doesn't have these red stains on it. I had spilled wine on it and made it look all.
Looks like that.
I took like some paint, tried to make it like blood, just a failed attempt at an artistic thing. But yeah, this book is it's a round robin collection of stories by well-known sword and sorcery authors based on an unfinished Robert E. Howard tale. And it's pretty wild because I think it starts out with this, this barbarian guy. He's raised by wolves, and then by the time it gets to the end, after all these authors have contributed to it, I think he's got like a bionic arm and like supernatural powers.
Yeah, it was a really wild thing. And I talked. Richard L. Tierney did an installment in that too, and I talked with him about that. And I really enjoyed the book, and I was telling him that, but he said by the time that book was through, it was as convoluted as the Bible.
Yeah. I don't even remember if I finished it because it goes on. But what I liked about it was that each author's individual voice really shone through, and you're reading the same story, but it's like it's feels totally different because of whatever their prose style or their different take on what's going on creatively. And I really liked that. And again, like I was friends with you and Byron. We were all writing these stories and all had our bands. And I thought, it'd be cool to maybe like do a collaboration thing. And so I started thinking of ideas, and I just had this vision come to me of this like sword and sorcery hero that slayed vampires. And I had these song lyrics I'd written that didn't have any real specific meaning, but they talked about this phantom-clad rider and had vampires and gothic atmosphere going on. So I thought maybe I could do like a sword and sorcery character that the stories have like this Hammer Films gothic kind of fog enshrouded graveyards kind of atmosphere, but it has the blood and thunder of Robert E. Howard and all my favorite sword and sorcery authors. So I presented the idea to you and Byron, and you guys were really all into it, and it just went from there. And I penned the first chapter, sent it on to you, and you guys ran with it. And then when DMR Books was interested in publishing it, we decided we'd do a second episode to make the book bigger, and we did that, and it turned out great. I love Karnov. The book's excellent.
Yeah, a lot of people like that. And that is available through DMR Books at dmrbooks.com. Carav Phantomclad, writer of The Cosmic Ice. I had a great time writing that. And speaking of Karnov, now you, I believe, have some upcoming tales that are in some upcoming publications this year. So one of those is a Karnov story, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That is slated to be published in Tersova magazine. It is, one of the newer Karnov tales I've written outside of things from the original book.
Is that the fall or winter issue of that this year?
Issue in 2024 is what it appears in. The tale is called The Rune of Flodawar.
Did you say winter issue?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's something to look forward to. And also, I believe you have more fiction coming out this year. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have a story in Tales from the Magician's Skull that's slated for 2024. That's an Eridus tale. He's my sword and sorcery hero that protects this arcane tome that's used to summon these alien queens from beyond the stars. I've got a couple tales about him. That's going to be in Tales from the Magician's Skull. And then I have an occult detective tale I wrote, which is kind of different. It's this noir style occult detective tale, but it's connected to Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborea mythos. And that's going to appear in a magazine that I just recently heard of. It's called Mobius Boulevard. It's like a sister magazine to the weird fiction magazine called Dark Horses. So that's supposed to appear in June. So so I got those three things. It'll be in Kursova, Tales from the Magician's Skull, and Mobius Boulevard.
And that's quite a bit, especially considering all the projects the musical projects that you're working on at the same time, which you're recording vocals for the Cauldron Born, the next Cauldron Born album, Volsung Sword, as well as working on a new Eternal Winter album. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep. Wailing away on the new Cauldron Born stuff, and then I'm in the studio recording the next Eternal Winter epic.
Okay. And can you tell us anything about the forthcoming Eternal Winter album? I mean, as far as, if nothing else, as far as lyrical themes and maybe even musical direction?
Yeah, sure. It's musical direction. It's always hard for me to say. It's just another chapter in the crazy version of epic metal we do. Thematically, it's based on a tale I wrote that has to do with the mysteries of the Templar Knights, and is connected to like this kind of cosmic horror sword and sorcery tale. And that sounds kind of wild, but that's the theme behind it. And this one actually is going to be a concept album that's very very conceptual and goes in order, unlike what I mentioned before.
The past albums, none of those were concept albums, correct?
Well, like I said, within the cast of Shadowgate was, but it did, like I said, the stories were kind of like intermingled. It didn't flow like a metal opera, say, or something. Metal opera is not really the correct term, but you know what I mean.
So there's really no chronology to those.
Right. That's right.
I got you. Okay, so you have these different levels in with sword and sorcery heavy metal now. And it's like the top level would be guys like yourself, the bands that have guys like yourself who are published authors, as well as make albums that pretty much strictly deal or solely deal with sword and sorcery themes. So that's up here, and then next down below that, I would say, and I'm not demeaning any of these bands by putting them in levels like this. I'm just saying this is how it goes as far as sword and sorcery heavy metal. So the next down from that, you would have these bands that only write lyrical themes dealing with sword and sorcery, and like you and I have both done, like say songs inspired by Robert E. Howard, texts and whatnot, and you have, and then before down below that, you would have proto metal bands, and I would say a proto metal band was some of the bands that maybe influenced some of the bands like mine and yours. I wouldn't personally, I wouldn't call Manowar an influence. I like Into Glory Ride a lot. They were never an influence on my music. Manilla Road was never an influence on my music, and that's a common misconception that people were reviewing my music. I got into heavy metal back in the 80s, and I was more influenced by British heavy metal bands. And the same bands like Manilla Road and Omen and Brocas Helm and all those bands were listening to. So I was not influenced by these American bands personally. But I would call these bands proto-metal bands. For example, I'm kind of on the fence with Manilla Road because you have to hand it to Mark. He was the first guy who wrote a song referencing Howard's text, Robert E. Howard's text. And I think that was probably late 70s or maybe early 80s or whatever with Queen of the Black Coast on one of the early Manilla Road albums. But these are sort of proto-metal bands like Manilla Road, and later on they became full-blown sword and sorcery bands. Same thing, I think, with Cirith Ungol. They had a lot, it was just rock songs. That some of it wasn't even metal. And later on, though, they were doing, I guess, the last few albums maybe, or last album, doing all sword and sorcery themes, as far as I can tell. And there are some other bands, too, some proto-metal bands, or proto-sword and sorcery heavy metal bands. And then you have these bands that they put a cool album cover on the front, but they don't really have anything. They might have one fantasy song, and it's kind of generic. It doesn't reference anything in specific, which I call van art bands. You know, the old van art from the 70s, they would paint these fantasy things on the side. But and a band like that would be Molly Hatchet, which, you know, that would be the prime example of a van art band, because those album covers, those Frazetta album covers, have nothing whatsoever to do with that band's music. It's just totally false advertising with you know, a band like Molly Hatchet. But that being said, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I know what you mean, because back in the 80s, they would draw you in with these fantasy album covers, and they would have some songs that you know, would deal with sword and sorcery or whatever, but then it would be mixed in with songs like you know, you see a song that is based on some epic theme, and then the next track is called like "Rockin' in the Night" or something like that. It you know, it's more of like a hard rock context with the lyrics mixed in with like the more heavy metal style sword and sorcery. And yeah, it kind of, I'm on the fence because I want to say it gives a false impression, but at the same time, I'm pretty fond of a lot of those albums. So I think it worked, but yeah, you're not getting the same, the material doesn't have the same depth, I think, lyrically and thematically, and more so than just that, but also musically, because I think the songs that are based on these more epic themes are they tend to be more musically adventurous. Also, it's just something I think it does to, you know, to the composer when they know. I mean, you could think of, for example, you know, even in classical music like Wagner. You know, I mean, we all love, you know, Wagner's music and everything, but would we be as attracted to it if they, you know, the pieces weren't called like Entry of the Gods into Valhalla or something like that? It adds this mystique that I think can be lost if they're not genuine to the vision, I guess, if that makes sense. So I see what you mean. I don't think that there's anything wrong with just dabbling here and there in it, but I do agree with you that some artists have a stricter vision when it comes to the themes, and that can appeal more to some people.
Mm-hmm. And some bands, I think, maybe just see movies and they write about it. And that's cool. Like you're saying, I like a lot of these. I like Omen. I mean, Omen, I think their first two albums were great albums. And, on the second album, Morning of Danger, they have Ruby Eyes of the Serpent, which is obviously referencing Robert E. Howard or John Milius's Conan the Barbarian. And then there's a Cyborg Lust, which is, I guess, about the Terminator movies or whatever. So there's still reference to those movies. It's still there. And a lot of the things I think, too, some people are really into the aesthetic of the sword and sorcery thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. And a lot of people that don't read it, they experience it through games like Elden Ring and some of these other video games, and also metal music, which is a really cool thing, especially for us, and movies. So anyway, with that being said, do you want to add anything to that?
I would say that it was a product of the times a little bit. The 80s, the sword and sorcery boom at the box office and all that. I remember being a kid going into the video rental stores and that stuff was everywhere. And then the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, there were huge displays, and I would see the Frank Frazetta posters and just be blown away. I loved that, and I'm sure a lot of people did too. So I'm sure when those artists were trying to think outside of the box, that's what was going on at the time. So I'm not surprised that that's how it was. Well,
do you want to add anything to the conversation that you want to do that, or do you want to wrap it up? You want to tell us how to get, now you run your own record label, which tell us a little bit about that before we wrap up, and how to get your albums.
Right. We used to have a full-blown website and everything, but nowadays we do most of it through the Bandcamp. So I believe now it's just bandcamp.eternalwinter.com, and or vice versa, however that works. And all our stuff is on there. And that's right, I have my own label, Majestic Metal Records. My label, it's what I release my stuff on. You can find the albums we talked about, and then also some various compilations and things like that in the Bandcamp.
Okay, so if somebody doesn't remember all this, they could just put in Eternal Winter in Google and type Bandcamp, and it'll take you straight to your page, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, if you don't have anything else you want to tell us about, then we'll go ahead and wrap it up for now.
Okay, yeah, I think we covered everything. It was great talking to you, Howie. I appreciate it.
You as well. I appreciate you coming on here and helping me out with this. And so go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I said anytime. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been Matthew Knight and Howie Bentley for episode 2 of Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. Tune in next week for the next episode.
All right.